I would actually like to start with the talks, and the first presenter will be Måns Nilsson. He's from the Stockholm Environment Institute, where he's the deputy director. He's actually responsible for the research strategy of SEI. He's also a visiting professor at KTH. This is the Swedish acronym, right?
Yeah,
so it's the
Royal Institute of Technology.
Exactly. Yeah. Thanks for jumping in. And he will talk about the need for coherent policies and how a joint vision may help us for moving forward toward the implementation of sustainable development goals. I think that's your entry point, as far as I understand it, with a few examples from the energy area. And with that said, I would thank you already in advance for coming here and giving this presentation to us, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Very glad to be here, and it's been tremendously interesting couple of days, I think. But now I also feel that the formal part of the program can end. And so I'd like to kind of encourage that you also intervene, ask questions if there are things that you need to have clarified over as I move along my presentation. I decided to modify my presentation quite a bit because first, there's been quite a lot of information about energy futures and sustainable energy, and I don't think I need to duplicate or replicate what has been done in, for instance, the Global Energy Assessment and other presentations. Second, this year is a particularly interesting year in the global collaboration because the United Nations have now set in motion two very important processes for global development and sustainability. One is the SDG process, the development of Sustainable Development Goals, which was decided in Rio +20 meeting on demand from UN member states. And the second is the post-2015 development agenda, which is to set the new agenda after the Millennium Development Goals are moving out in 2015. And so these are parallel processes going on in the UN system. One is kind of spearheaded by the Secretary General, and one is more driven by the member states. And as usual with UN processes, they are messy, politicized, and unpredictable. So three things we don't like as scientists, but maybe three things that we can help also mitigate as scientists. So my talk will be about some reflections about this and lay down some principles and concepts to illustrate what development agenda can look like and how one might start thinking about sustainable development goals with examples from energy. So there are three kind of core principles that were laid down in the Rio process that are now being sort of called into question in the UN process. One is coherence, another is universality, and the third is integration. And I think it's important to lay down these principles before taking a first stab at development agendas and development goals. And if we talk about universality, it's really about everybody on the planet. And two things to keep in mind is that people everywhere share the same basic rights, needs, and aspirations for human well-being. It's about livelihoods, it's about dignity, it's about social inclusion, and things like that. The second is that our planet is shared. So what we've learned from the last couple of decades of systems analysis at the global level is that we are one, and that how one part of the planet develops and behaves and consumes will affect other parts of the planet. So we have a shared responsibility to handle this and to manage this. The third is the integration aspect, that social, environmental, and economic spheres or dimensions are not separate, but they are interacting dimensions in real geographical spaces, and they should be treated as integrated and not as separate pillars. And we have, together with a group of institutions around the world, tried to set up a kind of a research network of think tanks and research institutes for how to conceptualize this and provide knowledge support for these political processes. And one important starting point is at the macro level to recognize the relationship and the dimensions of environmental and resource issues, here represented as ecological footprint per capita, although that might not be the best metric, on the one hand, and social development and well-being on the other. Now, we've seen the graphs over the last couple of days between the relationship between Human Development Index and energy consumption, for instance, and I could say this is a variation of this in some way. But the point is that we need different pathways to the same goal. And of course, we need to find a place where 9 billion people can live within our environmental space, meaning we cannot go too high above the first line in this diagram. And we need to find development pathways that ensure people's well-being all over the world. So ultimately, we need to find ourselves in the lower right-hand corner. But the point is that different countries and societies come from different parts of this diagram, and the pathways to get there will be different. And I think making that point explicit can be one part of finding unified goals and metrics towards those goals. But then drilling down a little bit into actual goals, we will need to start somehow from a conceptual frame of sustainable development that goes beyond and go beyond the environmental, social, and economic trilogy to something that is simple and understandable, but not too simple so that it becomes stupid. It needs to somehow capture the complexity of world sustainable development and still draw out the essence. And we are starting to dabble with a simple image that we call the cake, where we have people's well-being in the core of the cake. In the top layer, we have the basic needs and rights, the income, opportunities, services, such as energy and water and food, but also culture, dignity, and social inclusion. But in order for that to happen, you need to have an enabling context, and that's the second tier, where you have the resources and the different forms of capital and institutions that societies build upon in development. It's including also infrastructure and resources in different societies. And this interacts then with the third layer that needs to be part of Sustainable Development Goals, which are the international public goods that are global commons, if you like, collective action issues, the climate change being one, but there are many others that has to do with markets, security, etc. So these are the development goals, but underlying them you have ultimate drivers that you form part of society's way of overcoming and reaching these goals. And those are the layers in the cake. So we conceptualize, for instance, a slice of the cake, for instance, on energy. You need to drill down in both governance, innovation pathways, and social trust and cohesion issues to formulate sort of the contributing goals that are needed to achieve those ultimate goals that are represented at the top. So that's a little bit kind of work in progress, and it's a sort of opening for a debate about how to best conceptualize it. But we feel it's really important to take a step further from economic goals here, social goals here, environmental goals here, which is a tendency that we see coming over and over again in the policy process. So what does this mean in terms of, for instance, looking at energy? Well, the core is, of course, people's well-being, and at the poverty end of this scale, it's about the basic step of the ladder, energy for basic needs, and the energy that you need to achieve the Millennium Development Goals. We have heard it, it's providing lighting, cooking, and other services. But as societies grow and develop, like all societies will and should, there will be need for energy for more productive and industrial purposes and for inducing economic activity. In fact, one can doubt whether providing just energy for basic needs is at all sustainable in the long term, because you don't create the income basis to maintain that. In the interest of time, I've removed all the slides about climate change and 2 degrees, etc., that we have so many times heard already. But if you combine the energy services needs for development with global resource constraints and climate change constraints, you get to certain global balance sheets, pathways that you need to stay within certain constraints. And this is based on some basic modeling work we did, starting from the GEA and doing some additional modifications, taking into account assumptions about energy, technology, about efficiency improvements, etc. We find that in order to meet these challenges at the same time at the global scale, we need to bend the curve on primary energy use so that we can get, instead of a doubling or 50% increase of energy use, we will need to come down by a couple of percent. Part of this efficiency is about electrification, so electric production will be growing up to 2050. But the point is that the pathways becomes very different, breaks down very differently for different societies. And in this model we used 22 big world regions, and we see illustrations here that predominantly poor region like India can continue to grow its energy demand up to 2050. Emerging economies that are growing quickly like China, they can continue to grow for a while, but they ultimately have to bend the curve. And rich societies such as Western Europe need to start coming down in energy use rather quickly. And this totality of this picture will then add up to the global all. So if you take the implications from this kind of frame and analysis, what is the difference then between Millennium Development Goals and a 2050 Sustainable Development Agenda? Well, in terms of energy access, we have the Sustainable Energy for All goals, like ensuring universal access by 2030. By 2050, we need to ensure enough supply for productive economic activities worldwide. When it comes to efficiency, Sustainable Energy for All sets a good first stamp, doubling the rate of improvement in energy efficiency. But by 2050, we need to accelerate those efforts, and we need to see how, through electrification, for instance, of industrial processes and of transport systems, we can improve efficiency even further. Much of that electrification will not be possible to obtain before 2030. And of course the low carbon energy, where we have the goal doubling the share of renewable energy. We need to continue that doubling. We need to ensure that at the same time that land and water requirements are balanced with other needs, such as food production. And we need to induce a rather quick retirement of, for instance, coal-fired power stations, combined with CCS when it's feasible. So in our analysis, making this happen, going beyond poverty to development for all, we need to be more aggressive than most scenarios have shown so far in terms of efficiency improvements. And this slide compares some of the basic, some of the global scenario studies done by different actors. And we find that to reach the scenarios that we developed, we need to find rates of efficiency or intensity reductions by around 2.8%, 2.5 to 2.8% per year, so that by 2050 we're only using 1/3 of the energy per GDP as we do today. This is very ambitious, of course, but if you look at best available technologies and what different industries actually estimate, it's not undoable. Then, drilling into the cake, and I will wrap up rather quickly, we need to look at transformation pathways and how the social and technological innovations required can move along the S-curve. And the policies to move along the S-curve will change over time, from R&D to niche market support to development of more competitive markets and to create stable market signals at the end. This is not something I would like to go through, but it's also to look at systematically at the structural barriers that are impeding these transformations and drilling into the governance measures that you need to overcome those structures. So that is first cut from our end to try to illustrate the development and sustainable development goal challenge in terms of energy. And I'd like to end by preaching a little bit to the choir here. But when we go into the UN politics and system, this is not, it's not the choir at all, but it's actually some real battles that are surprisingly present still. There is a strong tendency to keep treating environment and development as separate domains that should be kept separate with separate goals. It has to do with professional disciplines, it has to do with turf war, and it has to do with the strong concern from the people that are concerned with poverty, that this will dilute their ambitions, etc. And you have the similar problem from the environmental side. But we have to keep fighting this and maintain the system's understanding of environment and development as interconnected. We need to keep fighting the tendency to move away from universality. This is called into question all the time. Should these goals really be relevant for rich countries, or is it really about extreme poverty eradication? Now we have a shared planet. We have to have goals, commitments, and measures for all countries in the world. And keep fighting the tendency to, again, pit societies and people against each other, where the UN politics is somehow geared towards this. If that group says that, we will say the other thing. And staying away from finding a shared development agenda post-2015. Thank you very much.